I talk about this idea of taking, small steps, baby steps, in order to establish habits that are more sustainable, that are more consistent. And this plays right into the experience of walking a labyrinth, one turn at a time, one step at a time. And building healthy habits is a parallel process to healing trauma. And getting into the whole sovereignty of being able to go, okay, I want to choose this versus this is what I should do. Really important to feel like the I that is involved in this process of healing is choosing each step of the way, that I have autonomy. Otherwise, the feelings of being helpless, hopeless, trapped that trauma elicits, that's just going to come right back.
Yeah.
So being a facilitator in healing trauma, it's a really tricky process because you want to make sure that you're providing clear structure, guidance, so that they know what steps are helpful. At the same time, there needs to be enough flexibility that they feel like they can make it their own. That way, they're truly stepping into a healing space rather than sort of an artificial, well, this is how so-and-so healed. Just do the same thing they did. It will never work.
So, hello and welcome everybody to Golden Thread Labyrinth's podcast. This is episode number 3, and we're actually on location today. We are at a scout building that the people were kind enough to let us use to paint some canvas labyrinths. So we're out here. We've got one of our labyrinths set up out back for people to walk, and we're painting a couple, one for our own demo purposes and the other one for a customer actually out in Boulder, Colorado. So we're excited to get these canvas labyrinths rolled out, and so far so good. A lot of learning curve, but I'll introduce us. I'm Alan Cowley. This is Mike Thomas and Dr. Dylan Odner, and we're Golden Thread Labyrinths, and this is our podcast.
This site is so great. I'm hoping we sort of form a relationship, even with the scout group. We could come in and paint a labyrinth with them. I think that could be a really amazing thing. But our last episode was mostly focusing on turns in your life and comparing that to turns within the labyrinth. There are things, especially with the Chartres Cathedral design, the 13th century design, where it's so symmetrical and yet not quite symmetrical. We've gotten into that. But there are points along the cross, right? The Christian cross, where you meet from two different sides, right? And so we did lots of chatting, and that was a podcast episode where Mike was unfortunately not able to join us. So the juices got flowing when he was watching the episode, and so we wanted to do a partial part 2 and clean up some of those ideas and bring in maybe a more of that trauma-informed perspective that Mike talks about.
And just as we hand it over as well for your thoughts, just one of the things that's beautiful about this group is we find there are often places where we kind of complement and supplement each other in the way that we think, and we come from different backgrounds. And so I'm excited to hear what you have from your more trauma-informed somatic technique, and about the turns in life in the labyrinth. And so, Mike, what are your thoughts?
Well, I had a lot of thoughts come up. Whenever I hear these two talking, I always get inspired. But one thing in particular stuck out to me, and that's about how the labyrinth is a process, like life is a process. And when you look at the challenging things that come up that can be stressful and even traumatic when our nervous systems are in a space of overwhelm, it's really easy to go to a place of, I want this suffering over now, as if, there's an end point and this is exactly what I need to do. Here's the formula, right? And we all know life is more messy than that. It's not as simple in any problem that you have in life, let alone something where you're recovering from chronic stress or trauma. It's about connecting to the present moment and recognizing, okay, so what's going on in my present moment? What's my body telling me? And the definition of trauma in certain circles is when we're getting flashes from the past, flashbacks, it's commonly referred to as. So our sensory experience is triggering something from the past, and it feels like that past experience is happening now. And the experience of a labyrinth is about one turn at a time, one step at a time, right? And so it's this wonderful parallel for the experience of healing trauma, because in order to go from a place of stuck in a trauma state to a place of resolution, post-traumatic resilience, it's often called, when you can transform the body response from that stuck state into this new sense of identity and peace and relaxation, and this sense of like, oh, it's safe now. Getting to that space requires being in the present moment and going, is everything I'm experiencing right now actually
Right now.
from right now? Or is it something that I'm drawing in from the past unconsciously? Am I pulling it in? And the labyrinth is this beautiful metaphor and literal experience too, of taking one turn at a time and just being here now and going, what can I do with this present moment, and how can I ensure I'm experiencing it as the present moment? And whatever's coming in from the past, am I able to recognize that and go, oh, okay, something from the past is coming in. Let's reconnect to my body to the degree I'm capable and see how I can use this next turn in the labyrinth and be in the process. Let time unfold as it does rather than trying to rush it.
Yeah, so many thoughts came up for me, but one has to do with, the idea of Jungian, mostly psychology, and the concept of archetypal things, that versus what is an archetype. And when we get to singular archetypes, it's very easy to understand archetypes, embodied characters. The father archetype. Mm-hmm. It's a cookie cutter that, what is the constellation of images and behaviors that surround this idea of the father figure that surpasses time and space, where you grew up, etc. There's variants of what a father is like in West Africa and what they are like in Sweden, 1,000 years ago, etc. But there are archetypal similarities as well. What's much harder to understand is when people start talking about archetypal situations, or the archetype of the labyrinth. So I wanted to touch on that for a second because it's somewhere in between. The archetype of the Odyssey journey from the Odyssey by Homer is an archetype, right? It's a journey, it's a process, mm-hmm. right? Start here, right? And so it's been applied to so many things. Oh, what an Odyssey you've been on. Same with a pilgrimage. Okay, there is an archetypal quality to this. It's a spiritual pilgrimage. It's a movement from one place to a holy site, and the transformation that happens to you while you're on it. There's some commonalities throughout the world. But you can't picture the Odyssey or picture a pilgrimage. You can't fit it into one space like you can a labyrinth. So that's why I'm thinking more and more of the labyrinth as the archetype of process, right? Mm-hmm. Of starting in one, and again, it's not the only, a gateway, a doorway is an archetypal feature, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But it's not extended. It's a threshold, right? And there are plenty of guardians or threshold archetypes, but the idea of a full encompassing cosmology of the labyrinth, I think, is why it has been jumping out so much for so many people for thousands of years, but also right now in this moment, bringing it up as the process of dealing with trauma. It deals with time and it deals with space in a very contained way.
This might sound like a little bit of an aside, but I think it might be useful. I'm realizing right now that for the many thousands of times that I've heard the word archetype, that I don't think I remember ever having to define it back in grade school when you do the vocabulary quizzes. And I wonder how much I assume about its definition. And do you have like a kind of an easy way, because it is one of those words where I feel like it's used but never fully defined, and if we're kind of putting so much into what that word is, it might be useful to parse it out a little bit.
Yeah, so in Jungian psychology, and there are different definitions for it, the reason you weren't writing about it in grade school is because it really has, even though Jungian psychology is almost on a back turn, it's in decline in some ways, I think, in terms of its acceptance in society, some pushback that I think is very fair, but I won't get into all that. But words like archetypes have become commonplace since Joseph Campbell and The Hero's Journey, and some other forms of popularizing it in writing and movies. But the word archetype actually is from Plato. So he more often uses the idea of what are called Platonic ideals. So I'm not just taking it because there's a table here. He uses the example of there are tables, and then there's the archetype or the ideal of table. Does something have tableness? And if you remove one of its legs and it still stands, then it's still table. But if you flip it upside down and do something else with it, it no longer has its tableness.
Yeah.
So that's getting to what an archetype is. I use that metaphor of a cookie cutter, but it is a universal or close to universal ideal concept.
So it's kind of trying to say, when we use the word archetype in this context, we're talking about human archetypes, not table, but
Right.
This is human.
Right.
So if we look at an image like the Labyrinth, we're saying that equates to humanity.
Right.
And on an archetypal level, it doesn't mean that you can look at a labyrinth and go person.
Right.
But when you get into the inner workings of what does it correspond to, what does it symbolize, what the effects of it are on others,
Right.
it does seem
Yeah.
to follow that pattern of being human in a certain weird way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what we could say about archetypes is the same as what it's troubling to define about mythology or things like that, which is that they have a lot of qualities. A starfish, if you cut off one of its appendages, it will grow into a full star. I know I'm over explaining it, and I don't think that that's 100% true, but that is true of archetypal mythology.
It will restore itself to its fullness.
Or if you take a small part of a labyrinth, of a myth, and analyze it,
it will expand out to
you'll
the
see
fullness.
echoes of the full myth being told there. So that's one example. I'm writing a book in the process, and that's one of those qualities of what makes myth so changeable and adaptable. And yeah.
So to bring all of this back in, and why I'm glad that I asked that question, because it really does help me process exactly what we're talking about on a more detailed level. When you were speaking about the I guess the stuff that we store, or the early life stuff that maybe is held on to later on, that you're noticing and you're looking at, this is like that time, or our body responds because it's like the past. And you said one of our most important questions is this now, or is this the real thing, or is that something from the past, right?
Yes.
So when I was considering some of this, I started thinking about the patterns of behavior that are built up over time, because those are the ones that I find are the hardest to break myself out of the previous reality, now realizing how much it's overstayed its welcome. So there are certain things about the way that I fit my life into the context of work. And there's a certain relationship that I had formed with the idea of work, and the way that I would respond to what happened there, and how it worked. Some of those patterns were healthy, some of them weren't.
Yeah.
And the patterns that I discovered are unhealthy and are still persisting in my behavior are mostly ones that are like sensing previously held expectations that I think others have on me. Weird things like that, where I'm like, there are no expectations in this circumstance, but I can still feel like somebody else from the past has those expectations on me, and so my body responds in kind as if I've got this weight of other people and their expectations, even though it's something I've consciously let go of and tried to separate from. My body still responds with that, I guess, false archetype.
Yeah.
What I had perceived as my humanity, my relationship to work, was a false archetype, and now I'm trying to find something a little bit more pure and
When
human
the
in a
cookie
way.
cutter doesn't fit anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a process of integration where we have. You're gonna have to correct me if I'm not using archetype correctly in this context, but I'm seeing how archetypal packages, ideas within the process of healing trauma could be really useful in the process of integrating trauma. That is to transition from the archetype that's traumatized to the more integrated, full, true self that we're becoming.
Yeah.
Right. So in IFS, which stands for Internal and Family Systems, I'm not trained in this therapy art form, but
Heard
it's
great things about it.
it's amazing. Dr. Richard Schwartz essentially started paying attention to the commonalities in all of the clients that he worked with over the years, all of his patients, and noticed common themes and started to create a system, not that was his idea, but it just sort of organically appeared to him, you might say. He started to recognize, oh, there's a pattern here.
Yeah.
Why don't I start working with people based on this pattern? And so the pattern is basically this, that there's this idea that started to emerge of a capital S self that I'm sure is archetypally
that's Jung.
relevant in Jungian philosophy,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
And the Atman, from Eastern religions is where he borrowed it from, but yeah.
Gotcha. So I'm guessing he probably used it for that reason because there's some tradition and history behind it. But the process of shifting from a fragmented, fractured self, you might say, the archetypes that show up are various forms of what he calls protectors. And there are two major categories. I believe, I might be using the terminology slightly wrong, but you get the idea with the archetype. One's a firefighter. That is, it quickly addresses crises. It's not necessarily very neat or messy or not very organized. It's messy. Right. So an addict archetype shows up. That's a firefighter. That's a protector part. It's trying to protect you by keeping you from feeling overwhelming pain through a substance or behavior that's addictive. It numbs out that overwhelming feeling. And if you look at Gabor Mate's work, where he talks about, if we look at addiction in terms of what is it trying to accomplish on an unconscious level, it's actually just trying to numb out overwhelming pain. It's unresolved trauma is what addiction is. It's an attempted solution. So and then there's another sort of opposite type of protector. Opposite is such a
But
relative word, right? But in this context, it's very different from the firefighter. It's a manager, I believe, is the type of archetype that it is. So it's very rigid. Instead of chaotic, like an addict archetype, for example, it's structured. It's judgmental. It's like, this has to be just so, right? So the parts of us that are self-criticizing, very much a manager type of protector,
right? But you can see when there's that there's the time when the baby that's thrashing around wants to be swaddled and wants rigid, clear-cut rules. So that within yourself, sometimes
You need that.
you need, if you are an addict or in an addict moment, that firefighter isn't what you need to be told that there is series of things you can't do.
Well,
Right.
going back to
Yes.
last time we were talking about the baby gate as permissions for a child to kind of go up a certain amount without hurting themselves too
Right.
bad when they make mistakes. Well, there are certain parts of the addict thing where there's no longer a baby gate there. And I'm speaking
Yeah.
for myself. The limit I have is 0 because after that is death.
Right.
And maybe that's not true on a realistic level. If
But
I
you
had
create-
one more,
AA
I
creates
might
a
know.
mythology around
But the
that.
mythology that I believe in order to survive as an alcoholic or recovering alcoholic is that drink will kill me.
Right.
Maybe not the one, but it will lead to the drinks
two,
that
and then
do.
right.
And so that first one is the only one I can have a defense against, because then after that I no longer have defenses.
Yeah.
I've lost the battle. That's really interesting. But it's
Wrapping up the concept of IFS, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
The process, like Labyrinth, of healing these archetypes that are protectors doesn't come from resisting them.
Right.
It comes from loving them, from showing gratitude for finding out what were they intending to do to protect me that has become destructive. Like you were talking about before, the old archetype from the past no longer fits the mold. It's now destructive. It was protective before, but it's no longer protective. And so we need to figure out a way to give thanks, to show appreciation and love and non-resistance. And these parts will actually integrate into the whole capital S self. And that's really what the method of IFS does as a really genius form of trauma healing. It's this process of taking these fragmented, fractured, archetypal protectors and recognizing what their true intention is. It's to protect us.
It makes a lot of sense why when Mike read some of my a few chapters of my dissertation, and one of the things I remember you connecting to was I created a graph and a system, but the phrase that sort of went along with it was that shadow integration begets, in Jungian psychology, it's called the transcendent function, but what is it called? I can't come up with the word. But the equivalent of regeneration in Swedenborgian.
Shadow integration, or?
No, I mean, shadow integration is the modus operandi, the thing that makes it happen. But I can't believe it'll come to me in a second.
Yeah.
But the point being, it is by saying so. In family systems, I'm guessing the word family is actually referring to a family of archetypes.
Yes.
That all need to be seen as family, not as right. As
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
so the way I've heard IFS described as in effective terms is that when we talk about our own thoughts and feelings, and we talk about, well, one part of me says or feels this way and another part of me feels this way, it's kind of going, yeah, both of those parts are real.
Yeah, that's not an analogy.
That's not an analogy. Those are yourselves that you're
Yes.
dealing with from different archetypal parts of us. I feel like this connects also really well into some concepts in shamanism and soul retrieval. I don't know if you've heard of soul retrieval in shamanism, and that as we experience trauma in our past, that there are essentially fragments of our soul that are shattered off and left behind. And in shamanic soul retrieval, a shaman will work with their client to go into the dream world or their life, and use the guides that are there, the spirit guides, and actually find those shattered soul parts and reintegrate them. Is the point, is to bring them all together. And you know, in modern terms, a lot of people would just go, "Whoa, that's so woo-woo," and what the heck is that? But it makes just as much sense. It's very different language, perhaps, than modern science, and saying, "Well, this part of me does that, or that part of me does this." But those parts came from somewhere, and I think the language is really beautiful when we think about it as soul shatterings and
then
fragments and retrieval.
Yes.
And I think honors what we go through as people and the challenges of humanity.
It's funny that we never had this conversation before this live podcast recording, because I went to someone to try this process.
Yes.
Turned out to be a bit of a charlatan, but the reason I was attracted to it in the first place, I'm pretty pragmatic in how I approach healing, because my tendency, I know, I'm balancing my tendency, is to go into magical thinking. That was a lot of my archetypal childhood, was just like anything's possible, and I was completely ungrounded. So those concepts have always been very romantically attractive to me, right? And so I went into this process very much because the languaging around soul retrieval seems to be another languaging of the same concept of trauma healing. Unfortunately, the result of that particular inquiry was, several $1,000s later, I can get you back the part of your soul that you're missing, and essentially you've been infiltrated with a demon, so you better pay me the several $1,000s. It's like, oh man, it was such a beautiful concept. I wanted to buy into it.
And how sad, because it doesn't. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater,
Right?
And the hard part about things like that is it comes in so many forms, whether it's in your experience there, or a minister in whatever denomination, or any person with the ability to gain power and control.
And I don't say that I don't believe it. I just say that particular circumstance was
it's
unfortunate.
Absolutely.
Can I, first off, as a teacher, you just used the term "throw the baby out with the bathwater."
Yeah.
I used it with a class of 22, and they started. They burst into laughter. They got it instantly, but none of them had ever heard that phrase.
Really?
It must have gotten thrown out with the bathwater a generation ago. But that really does have to do with.
What's the mythology behind that story?
Well, folklore. But when I look at how complicated this idea and system is, and yet media, film, story, always is dealing with these ideas on a more intuitive, mythological level. If you take modern fantasy, or if you take something like Hunger Games, it's a society that is a post-apocalyptic, probably, society, or dystopian society, split into 12 districts. Okay, that's a very positive number, etc. Very mandalic. Mm-hmm. You can almost guarantee, because it's such an unhealthy society, that what really happened was that there was 13 districts, and one was ostracized from society instead of being integrated. And that, sure enough, in Hunger Games, there was a bombed to death that is not spoken of by anyone, a forgotten 13th district. Same's true with Game of Thrones. You have this unhealthy, dying society, and this wall to keep out the others, right? The ice from the far north, this huge rigid wall, and there are people beyond that wall, not just monsters. There's forgotten, and I'm forgetting what they're called, the woodlings or something like that. But the point is that from a backing up standpoint, the story of this show is this society will not be whole again until the family is united, till the ostracized prodigal son is brought back and integrated. And usually that happens with a common enemy archetype to force them to come back together.
This is bringing my thoughts to a Swedenborgian teaching, which at first sounds really strange, but I love it the more I think about it, which is that evil is permitted for the sake of salvation, which sounds, what the heck? And the reason why is because the only way that we can, in our own freedom, remove things, if we use the term evil for that reason, to remove evil so that we have just good left,
right,
is we have to do that in freedom and not have it stolen from us if we liked it.
Right.
So if we have a God that wants us to participate in creation, then he can't take it away from us
Right.
without us giving permission. So in our free selves, we have to be given the space to explore all of the parts of ourselves that we might want to explore.
Right.
And then of our free will, let them go.
Right. Which is a macrocosm of growing up as, you have to give those,
So I think
kids that choice.
the cookie cutter, though, to come back to that, when we have varying degrees of cookie cutting that happen throughout life, and I think that often when we think of childhood, we cookie cutter in a very particular way to protect in certain areas of life and maintain innocence, things like that. And then it's like we almost expand the cookie cutter when we get towards adult. What are we really working with here? What are the challenges? And we have to get into the nuances. So we lost connection there for a minute, so we'll hopefully be able to jump back in, which now I'm trying to remember exactly where that was.
You're talking about Emanuel Swedenborg.
Yes,
For those of
the
you who don't
permission.
know, he's a
Yeah.
18th century philosopher and theologian.
Yep. So, anyways, the idea of having to, of our own freedom, recognize the things that we're letting go of. And consciously, I think that early on in life we are working off of what our society, what our parents, what our family systems have said. This is what's normal and right. And that's the cookie cutter that we work from. But then as we're trying to make that our own, we go, some of those edges aren't edges that I like. And perhaps some of those edges are ones that we need to let go of. And that might even reintegrate some parts of us from the past that we would have otherwise explored. Whether it's good or bad, we don't know.
Yeah.
Whether it's something we want for ourselves or not would be a better way to put that, as opposed to the good or bad.
Right. Yeah. That's a really good way to, I think, circle back. What interested me, and continues to do so, about what you specifically brought in, Mike, for this was, as an academic, as a very heady person, I've always known I have more trouble connecting with the body part of the mind-body puzzle, right? And when someone who's trained in somatics, someone who has, in the mathematical equation of time and space, I associate that so much more with space, right? That you have experience and interest in living corporeal existence in space, right? And yet, when you study something like trauma, that is something that has equally to do with space and time, in a similar way to the Labyrinth, I think. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you're walking a labyrinth, it brings you to the present moment, as you've said. And yet, it's bringing in 1,000 years of archetypal data in those packages you were talking about as well. Trauma, when you are dealing with something, it's this dance of, this is the correct response for another time, right? And so it's a no-brainer, but if you are trying to deal with trauma, you are not trying to solve some pathology. You're not trying to say, hey, let's numb away. And people have tried to do that in the past. Let's numb away these feelings. Let's medicate away these feelings. That's not a long-term solution, because you instead need to say, do this dipping toe, the safety net, the baby gate, let's dip our toe into these PTSD moments, into these traumatic things in a way that you have autonomy, control. And that's why the labyrinths are not blindfolded and led through. They are traditionally, they are not, here I'm going to walk you into this shape and it's good. It is a self-guided, that's getting too real for me. I'm backing out. Not today. I can try again tomorrow. And it brings up all these same things with repetition. Let me see what happens if I just walk this labyrinth every day for a month, right? Is that going to bring it back to religious terms or Swedenborgian terms, COE, conquering the hells, ordering the heavens, and establishing a church on earth? I think that walking the labyrinth repeatedly, it is an order. It is creating a gentle form of order into your own mind, in a place probably where you need it most, maybe.
Building positive habits in any way will compound.
Right.
Mike, you were mentioning something about some of the compounding of changing just like even small, tiny habits, and how that can build up. Is that what you're kind of referring to? Is this stuff?
Absolutely. You pull that idea right out of my head. I was just thinking about that, and how to bring it into the conversation. So I talk about this idea of taking, small steps, baby steps, in order to establish habits that are more sustainable, that are more consistent. And this plays right into the experience of walking a labyrinth, one turn at a time, one step at a time. And building healthy habits is a parallel process to healing trauma. And getting into the whole sovereignty of being able to go, okay, I want to choose this versus this is what I should do. Really important to feel like the I that is involved in this process of healing is choosing each step of the way, that I have autonomy. Otherwise, the feelings of being helpless, hopeless, trapped that trauma elicits, that's just going to come right back.
Yeah.
So being a facilitator in healing trauma, it's a really tricky process because you want to make sure that you're providing clear structure, guidance, so that they know what steps are helpful. At the same time, there needs to be enough flexibility so they feel like they can make it their own. That way, they're truly stepping into a healing space rather than sort of an artificial, well, this is how so-and-so healed. Just do the same thing they did. It will never work.
Right.
And so in building habits and parallel with this process, there's this really cool concept from Dr. Anna Lemke. She wrote a book called Dopamine Nation, and how we have a very high-stress society, a very traumatized society in many ways, and how our dopamine systems are out of whack. And establishing healthy habits is a great way to restore that healthy dopamine balance.
Smooth the ups and downs
Yeah,
of the sugar highs or the dopamine highs.
Exactly. Addictive patterns, eating sugar or drinking alcohol or anything that spikes pleasure, dopamine, is going to give you a low. And so generally speaking, anything that you do as far as healing or establishing healthy habits, that is challenging, but you know that it's going to build a healthy adaptation, like strength training.
Right.
Yeah. You don't want to get, if your goal is to bench press 300 pounds, you don't get right under 300 pounds and go, let's try this. It's going to crush you.
It's incremental.
It's this slow, tiny step. And this process not only builds gradually enough that it's sustainable and it doesn't overwhelm you. I mean, those are sort of the obvious points. But in the background, your dopamine levels, your baseline gets higher and higher and higher as you do challenging things that don't come easy. And so, yes, there's suffering involved in unresolved trauma. Yes, there's facing that in the process of healing trauma. But just like healthy habits that allow you to raise your baseline level of dopamine, that is the lowest it goes, not spiking high and then dropping down below baseline, but elevating that baseline steadily higher. So generally a sense of well-being and optimism about life. That comes from challenging yourself, which is the exact opposite of what you're doing when you're initially trying to heal trauma. You're trying not to overwhelm them. You want to challenge me? But I'm overwhelmed.
Right.
It seems like a complete paradox, but it actually fits together perfectly, because what you do is you find, okay, so what's my window?
Right.
Of managing
Orange
stress.
theory.
So you get there to that boundary, and then you go, okay, that's enough for today.
Yeah.
And as long as that person, whether it's labyrinth walking or some other body-mind practice or whatever, or therapy, as long as they trust that hey, what we're going to do is we're going to push right now and see where this upper limit is. We've established that. We're not going back there.
Yeah.
And as long as there's a trust there. Right.
Yeah, like a safety protocol. This kind of might be a funny analogy, but if we think about, this is an idea that comes from a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, and it talks very much about these incremental changes. And one of the analogies he uses is an ice cube in a room that's below freezing. And so if we imagine that it's, say, 7 degrees below freezing, and that each day, if you walked a Labyrinth 7 days in a row, it would warm that room 1 degree every day. If you skipped a day, it would reset back down. This is taking his analogy and pushing it into that threshold thing.
Yeah.
But let's say you do that 7 days, you know that ice cube is melting at 33 degrees. It doesn't do anything before that.
Right.
You don't notice a difference, it doesn't seem to change, but that 7th day something happens and it starts melting because the threshold for it melting. So I'm just thinking about in terms of life, if we're trying to stay in that we're alive when we're not frozen, we're living when we're moving, walking is a good way to raise the body temperature a little bit. Staying in that habit keeps us above that temperature, and when we have the habit, it kind of has that threshold above freezing. But if we are out of those habits, if we're experiencing trauma too much and we're in that below our happiness threshold, it's really a slog to get back up and over it, because we have to do all of the work without feeling results for a while.
Yes.
And that's the hardest part, is that phase where it's like, I have to do the work and it doesn't feel like it's doing anything. Give up. I've been there before. And it's like, okay, and I've given up several times in the process of getting up the next day and then trying again. And oddly, I don't think it's setbacks, it's just that process you're talking about of, that was my cap for today. I just didn't have language for it, so thanks.
You're welcome. Not this is making me think of not knowing I had unresolved trauma. Like even 10, 15 years ago, I didn't even understand the concept of trauma trapped in the body as a stress response. So this is, the second half of my career, if you break it up into 25 years, is about the second half of it. All of a sudden, this factor became something I was aware of, and then I was able to look back on my life and go, oh, that's why everything was so damn hard all the time.
Yeah.
It felt like I was wearing a weight vest and walking uphill through a stream, and it was like, why is everything so hard all the time? I can't keep my eyes open. I got a full night's sleep. What happened? I don't feel rested. All of these things that were
Adrenal fatigue.
it was like that was my norm. And I would have that, and then moments of peaking out into hyperactivity. And so it was like either complete depression and lethargy, and like I wanted to I couldn't stop from almost passing out, to just crazy amounts of energy. And that's known as the PTSD cycles. You go above and below the line of overwhelm in terms of stress levels. Anyway, so I didn't realize that, like you were describing, I was going almost to the point of thawing out my frozen self, and then I'd give up because it was just too hard. And I'd just think, okay, well, this is my life. This is how I'm going to live. And without the knowledge of where you're going, without guidance, without structure, without somebody saying, I know it's hard.
Just do another day.
I've been there. Just another day. Just keep going. Keep
Hold
building
on to
that
this
tolerance.
golden thread.
Yes.
For a little bit longer, because that's what you're doing, is you're letting go of it. And in every arena, it is so understandable to be, when there is no pre-stated goal toward which you are working, it's just hard. It's hard to keep going when it could be right around the corner, some form of positive trend, or it could absolutely not be right around the corner in any, so we're not minimizing how hard that is, but maybe if you can continue to trust,
This is the beautiful thing about the labyrinth as a archetypal symbol, that the inner sanctum, that space where you are healed, exists in potential.
Right.
And that is our natural state, is to be healthy and to return to restore health. And it is a process.
And it doesn't matter if you, and this is so great, and I think a good way to tie things up.
Yeah.
Alan, you've been all in on designing, drawing labyrinths, as have I. Not at your level, but you can have a imprint, an archetype of this labyrinth in your head, and have the unique ability to put it down onto canvas. And while you're walking that labyrinth, even though you know that the goal is there in the center, you don't know where you are in the labyrinth.
No.
You don't know what okay, I'm at the beginning, I think, but no matter what, you get to a point where you say, how could I have lost where I am in this labyrinth?
On the same labyrinth that I've walked.
Right.
I created it, I designed it, and I've walked it 100 times, and
Right.
it's still.
Or this is not a 30-foot sharp reproduction.
Yes.
This is a 10-foot canvas labyrinth, and I'm still walking it, right? Like, that is the magic of compressing time and space into this accordion of that's what that a healthy, trustworthy in and out compression and dissonance that leads to transformation, not just from getting to the center, but from the process of getting there.
I actually have a quote that I was
Yeah.
thinking about bringing in, and this is the perfect
Yeah.
segue. So Marshall Rosenberg created the system of communication called nonviolent communication. And the point of it is to connect at the heart level as a human being to your needs and feelings to make life more wonderful. And so when you're in your survival self, this is a way I've adapted nonviolent communication and the steps in connecting to the heart. There's one way you can do it that is based in survival, and another way you can do it that's based in being in safety and social engagement, the best versions of ourselves. And in the final step, making a request free of demand is how it's phrased. The request, making the request and having it be a totally free request is safety, right? The best version of ourselves. Demanding that we get that request is the survival part, right? And the interesting thing that came up, so his quote is, perhaps, we never really know what we want until after we get it. If after we get it, it makes life more miserable, we know it isn't what we wanted. If it makes our life more wonderful, we know this is a strategy which will meet our need. That's why Paul Tillich, the theologian, says we need to sin courageously. You ask for what you want, hoping to meet your needs. If you get it, and it makes life worse, you learn that it isn't what you want. Mm-hmm. And this idea of moving through the labyrinth, thinking you know it, and then like, I don't know where I am. But how boring would life be if we knew exactly what we were going to get every time?
Well, and it wouldn't be a labyrinth.
Right.
And how important is that as a simple turning point, going back, and this is bringing it back to our title and the follow-up, this conversation to turning points in life in the labyrinth, is to have that notice of, even though this form should be known and I should know where I am and I don't, in terms of exactly this, it gives us enough doubt in our own ability to assess things to also then doubt the belief that healing isn't going to happen. Mm-hmm. The belief that this is the way it's always going to be. The belief that I'm always going to be this way, just give up. Those things are such powerful thoughts when we're down on ourselves. It's always going to be this way. Such an irrational untruth because it hasn't always been this way. So our evidence is,
yeah.
But that little bit of a labyrinth where you can go, I should know, but I don't, allows us to then doubt another part of ourselves and go, maybe I can doubt that negative thing that I've been thinking too, and trust that, nope, I can keep moving forward.
Yeah, it's like where faith and humility meet.
Yeah.
It's like having enough humility to recognize that faith is helpful, that not knowing how it's going to turn out and just having faith, okay, let's just follow this through. If I have the arrogance to think that it's definitely going to work out or that there's no way it can work out, I'm not allowing myself to be in the moment. And so stepping into humility, we can actually go, let's try this faith thing on, see how it works. Like maybe there's a possibility. It's like a curiosity that leads to optimism, maybe.
All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap this up. I wanted to mention that we are looking into some guest appearances coming up soon to share in this conversation with other voices and other people from different backgrounds, and to just expand our community more and more. And we're hoping that you're enjoying the conversations here and want to join it. Please do share, and get notified when we're on. So for everybody here at Golden Thread Podcast, see you later.
See ya.
Cheers.